Wisconsin River Valley, 1882. In the late autumn sun, which held more light than warmth, men built against the coming cold. They raised walls of hewn timber, their movements efficient, practiced, a shared rhythm of frontier survival. They notched logs, packed mud and moss into the gaps, and raised roofs that could bear a burden of snow, all except one. Tomasz Lewandowski moved to a different rhythm. His work was not with the axe, but with the earth itself. Down by the riverbank he spent weeks digging, his shovel slicing into the rich gray clay. He mixed it with sand and water in a shallow pit, working the slurry with his bare feet until it had the consistency of thick dough. Then he packed the dense mud into wooden molds, turning out row after row of uniform wet bricks that baked in the pale sun. The other settlers watched. They were not unkind men, but they were practical. They saw wasted time. "That's a month of firewood you could have been cutting, Tomasz," said Jedediah Smith, a farmer whose hands were permanently calloused from his axe handle. Tomasz just nodded, wiping sweat and clay from his brow. "Is wood for winter?" he said, his English still thick with the accent of his native Poland. Later, when he built a crude, temporary kiln and began firing his bricks, the smoke drawing a dark finger against the sky, the talk grew more pointed. Ira Calkins, the settlement's most respected builder, stopped by. He watched Tomasz stacking the finished bricks not outside, but inside his small, already built cabin. He was laying a second wall, a thick 10-inch shell of reddish-brown brick, against the interior of the log structure. Calkins shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "Son, I don't know how you built things in the old country," he said, his voice patient, as if explaining to a child. "But here that's just foolish. You're losing a good 2 feet of living space. It'll take you a cord of oak just to heat the brick, let alone the room. That wall will suck the fire dry." Tomasz paused, setting a brick into its bed of clay mortar. He looked at the half-finished wall, then at the concerned face of the builder. "It will hold the fire," he said quietly, and returned to his work. The mockery was quiet at first, but it was there. They called it Lewandowski's folly, the man building a brick oven to live inside, the Pole who thought he could teach the Wisconsin winter a new trick. What did this Polish brickmaker understand about the physics of thermal mass that generations of experienced, hardened frontiersmen had missed? The answer to that question would change how this entire valley survived the cold. It's a story about ingenuity, the quiet confidence of deep knowledge, and the simple, powerful truth of a warm wall in the dead of winter. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn the fundamental principle of thermal mass, a concept that modern eco-architects are rediscovering today. It's a lesson forged in clay and fire. So subscribe to this channel, and let's get into the science and the story of how one man's foolishness became the blueprint for survival. Let us know in the comments, what's the coldest temperature you've ever experienced? Tomasz Lewandowski was not a frontiersman. He was not a hunter, a trapper, or even a particularly good farmer. In the bustling, wooded landscape of Wisconsin, he was an anomaly. His hands, though strong, were not shaped by the axe, but by the fine grit of sand and clay. He was a brick maker, a trade he had learned from his father, who had learned it from his. His world in Poland had been one of measured heat. He understood the slow, patient heart of a kiln, the precise temperature at which clay vitrified into something permanent. He knew the difference between the quick, flashy heat of a pine fire and the deep, enduring warmth of a mass of superheated fire brick. His vocabulary was not of board feet and saw cuts, but of thermal inertia, heat soak, and the slow, graceful curve of cooling. He and his wife, Elżbieta, had come to America with their 2 small children, Jan and Zofia, seeking land and a life they could build with their own hands. They arrived with little more than their skill and a desperate hope. The land agent in Milwaukee sold them a plot in the Wisconsin River Valley, describing it in glowing terms of rich soil and abundant timber. He did not describe the winter. Their first one, in 1881, was a lesson in humility and terror. They lived in a hastily built log cabin, a standard structure identical to their neighbors. It was a sieve. The wind, a physical predator, found every microscopic gap in the chinking. It slipped through the seams where the roof met the walls and poured in under the door. Elżbieta stuffed rags into the cracks, but it was like trying to dam a river with handkerchiefs. The cold was a constant, occupying presence in their home. The iron stove in the center of the room was a demanding tyrant. As long as it was fed a steady diet of oak, it produced a small circle of habitable space around it. Beyond that circle, the temperature dropped precipitously. Water froze in a bucket just 10 feet from the glowing stove. The floor was a permanent sheet of ice, never thawing, even at midday. They lived their lives in layers of wool, their breath pluming in the air inside their own home. The worst part was the night. Around midnight, the fire, no matter how high they banked it, would inevitably die down to embers. The heat vanished instantly. There was no reserve, no lingering warmth. The cabin's temperature would plummet, seeking to equalize with the brutal cold outside. Tomasz and Elżbieta would wake to the sound of Zofia coughing, a dry, rasping sound that echoed the scraping of frozen branches against the roof. They would sleep huddled together under every blanket they owned, their bodies pressed together for shared warmth. And still, they shivered. The cold was relentless. It wasn't a single event. It was a grinding, weeks-long siege that wore down their spirits and their health. By March, Tomasz knew they would not survive another winter like that. He had the land, but he did not have a home. He had shelter, but he did not have warmth. He looked at the logs of his cabin, the supposed pinnacle of frontier construction, and saw only failure. The problem wasn't the logs. The problem was the air. The conventional wisdom of the Wisconsin frontier was sound, but incomplete. A well-built log cabin, with thick, seasoned timbers and tight chinking, was an excellent defense against wind. Wood is a decent insulator. A thick oak log has an R value of around 1 per inch, meaning an 8-inch wall provided about R8 of insulation. This was far better than a stone or simple clapboard house. The settlers understood insulation. They knew how to slow the transfer of heat from inside to outside. Ira Calkins could build a cabin so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade between the logs. But what Calkins and the others misunderstood was the difference between slowing heat loss and storing heat. Their cabins were like canvas tents. When you have a fire going, it's warm. The moment the fire stops, the warmth is gone. The air inside the cabin, which holds very little heat energy, cools down almost immediately. The log walls themselves, while slowing the escape of that heat, have very little capacity to absorb and hold it. They are a barrier, but they are not a reservoir. This is the failure of low-mass construction in a cold climate. Heat is generated, warms the air, and then immediately begins its journey to the outside. To stay warm, you must constantly generate more heat, which meant a relentless, back-breaking cycle of cutting, splitting, and burning wood. Families like the Schmidts, neighbors to the Lewandowskis, burned through 20 cords of wood in a single winter. Their days were consumed by the battle for BTUS, a battle they could only fight to a draw, never win. The physics of their suffering was simple. The stove heated the cabin through convection, warming the air, which then circulated, and radiation, sending out infrared waves that warmed surfaces directly. But the air, with its low density, couldn't store this energy. The wooden walls, floors, and sparse furniture had some mass, but not enough to act as a significant heat sink. So, when the stove went out, the radiative source was gone. The warm air quickly lost its energy through the insulated but low-mass walls. The result was a home that was never truly, deeply warm. It was a space that was merely less cold than the outside, and only then with constant effort. Floors remained frigid because the warm air rose to the ceiling, a phenomenon known as thermal stratification. The settlers' feet were always cold. Condensation, or frost flowers, would form on the interior walls and nail heads, where the warm, moist air from their breath and cooking met a surface cold enough to freeze it on contact. It was a sign that the wall itself was nearly as cold as the outdoors. This was the reality they accepted as normal. It was the price of living in Wisconsin. They saw the problem as needing a bigger fire, not a different kind of house. Tomasz Lewandowski, however, saw the house itself as the problem. He wasn't going to fight the cold with more fire. He was going to teach his house how to hold it. The work began in earnest in late August. Tomasz chose a spot on the riverbank where the spring floods had exposed a deep, rich vein of gray clay. He dug hundreds of pounds of it, hauling it back to his homestead in a wheelbarrow. He built a puddling pit, lined with timber, and spent days mixing the raw clay with water and a specific measure of sand he'd hauled from another bend in the river. This wasn't just mud, it was a recipe he knew by heart. The sand provided aggregate strength and prevented the finished bricks from cracking during firing. He trod the mixture for hours, the cool mud sucking at his ankles, until it was perfectly homogeneous. Next came the molding. He had built a dozen simple, bottomless wooden frames, the interior dimensions precisely measured. He'd slap a loaf of the prepared clay onto a sanding table, coat it in a fine layer of sand to prevent sticking, and with a practiced, forceful motion, press it into the mold. A quick scrape with a wire tool removed the excess, and then he'd deftly lift the mold, leaving behind a perfect, wet, gray rectangle on a drying board. Jan and Zofia, his children, watched in fascination. This was a magic they hadn't seen before, their father turning river mud into building blocks. He laid out thousands of these green bricks in long, neat rows under the sun. For 2 weeks they cured, slowly turning from a dark, wet gray to a lighter, dusty shade. Then came the most critical part, the fire. He constructed a temporary clamp kiln, a structure almost as impressive as the cabin itself. He carefully stacked the dried bricks into a massive cube, leaving channels and fire tunnels throughout the interior. He walled the outside of the stack with already fired bricks from a test batch, plastering the exterior with a thick layer of mud and clay to insulate it. He left openings at the bottom for stoking the fires and a small hole at the top to act as a chimney. For 3 days and 3 nights, he fed the kiln. He started with a small, slow fire to drive out the last of the water vapor, a delicate process where heating too quickly would cause the bricks to explode. Then, he gradually increased the heat, feeding cords of hardwood into the fire tunnels until the entire stack glowed a menacing cherry red, visible even in the daylight. The temperature inside the clamp approached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. This was the moment of transformation, where clay, sand, and fire fused into a new material, dense, hard, and permanent. The other settlers saw only a colossal waste of firewood. "He's burned more wood on those mud pies than I'll use before Christmas," Marcus Thorne, a timberman, remarked to Ira Calkins. They stood at a distance, watching the shimmering heat distort the air above the kiln. Calkins nodded grimly. "And now he's going to put it all inside his house. He's building his own tomb, I tell you, a cold one." After a week of cooling, Tomasz dismantled the kiln. The bricks that emerged were a tapestry of color, from rich terracotta to deep purplish brown, a sign of the varied temperatures within the clamp. They were heavy, dense, and rang with a clear, metallic sound when struck together. They were perfect. Now, the final stage. Inside his cabin, he began laying the inner wall. He mixed a mortar of clay, sand, and lime. Starting from the floor, he laid a course of bricks, leaving a 1-inch air gap between the brick and the interior log wall. Course by course, the shell grew. It was slow, meticulous work. Each brick was buttered with mortar and carefully tapped into place. He built arches over the single window and the door. The interior of the cabin shrank, becoming darker, more cave-like. Ira Calkins made his final appeal when the wall was halfway up. He stepped inside, the space already feeling cramped. "Tomasz, look at this," he pleaded, gesturing at the shrinking room. "Your wife won't have room to turn around. And I'm telling you, that brick is a heat thief. You'll light your stove, and all the heat will go straight into that wall. Your family will freeze before the room even gets warm. It's just not how it's done." Tomasz ran his hand over the rough, warm-colored surface of his work. He looked Calkins in the eye. "The wall is not a thief," he said, his voice calm and certain. "The wall is a bank. You give it heat, and it gives it back, slowly." Calkins threw his hands up in exasperation and left, convinced the Polish family was doomed by the stubborn foolishness of its patriarch. To understand what Ira Calkins could not, you have to understand the difference between insulation and thermal mass. It's the most important concept in building for extreme climates, and Tomasz Lewandowski understood it in his bones. Insulation, measured by its R value, is a material's resistance to heat flow. Wood, wool, moss, and trapped air are all good insulators. They act like a dam, slowing down the rate at which heat escapes your home. The log walls of a standard cabin were an attempt at insulation. They slowed the leak, but the leak was still there. As soon as you stopped adding heat with the fire, the house immediately began to cool. Thermal mass, on the other hand, is a material's ability to store heat energy. It's measured by a property called specific heat capacity. This is the amount of energy measured in British thermal units, or BTUs, required to raise the temperature of 1 pound of a material by 1 degree Fahrenheit. Water has a very high specific heat capacity, air has a very low one, and dense materials like stone, concrete, and brick have a very high one. Think of it like this. Your stove is a faucet, and heat is the water. An insulated, low-mass cabin is like a bucket with a small hole in it. As long as you keep the faucet on, the bucket stays full. The moment you turn the faucet off, the bucket quickly drains through the hole. A high-mass cabin, like the one Tomasz was building, is like a bucket with a giant, heavy sponge inside it. When you turn on the faucet, the water fills the bucket, but it also soaks deep into the sponge. It takes longer to fill. This is what Calkins correctly observed. It would take more energy to heat the cabin up initially, because you had to heat not just the air but the entire mass of the brick wall. You had to charge the thermal mass. But here is the magic. Once you turn the faucet off, the bucket of air begins to drain. However, the saturated sponge now begins to slowly release all the water it has stored, keeping the bucket full for hours and hours. The brick wall was Tomasz's sponge. It was a heat battery. Let's look at the numbers. A single one of Tomasz's bricks weighed about 4.5 pounds. His inner shell contained roughly 4,000 bricks. That's 18,000 pounds of dense fired clay lining his home. The specific heat of brick is about 0.22 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. To raise the temperature of that entire wall by just 1 degree, it had to absorb nearly 4,000 BTUs. To raise its temperature from a chilly 40 degrees Fahrenheit to a comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit, the wall had to soak up 120,000 BTUs of energy from his stove. This is a tremendous amount of energy. But once stored, it doesn't vanish. The wall, now warmer than the air in the room, begins to radiate that heat back into the living space. It becomes a gentle, massive, room-sized radiator. It releases its stored energy not in a quick rush, but over a period of 8, 10, even 12 hours. It smooths out the wild temperature swings of the frontier cabin. The fire could die down to embers at midnight, but the 18,000-pound wall, still glowing with stored warmth in the infrared spectrum, would continue to heat the home until morning. It broke the tyrannical cycle of constant fire stoking. Tomasz wasn't just building a wall, he was building a new climate. November brought the first frosts, and by early December, the Wisconsin winter had settled in. But it was in January of 1883 that the true test arrived. A mass of Arctic air, what the old-timers called a hard freeze, descended on the valley. For 18 consecutive nights, the temperature did not rise above minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was a razor. Trees groaned and cracked in the forest, their sap frozen solid. It was a killing cold, the kind that found any weakness and exploited it without mercy. In the Calkins cabin, life became a miserable cycle of stoking the fire and huddling close. Despite his tight construction, the cold was winning. Ira and his wife slept in shifts, one of them always awake to feed the stove. They hung blankets over the door and the single window, but the drafts were insidious. The floor was so cold that standing on it for more than a few seconds was physically painful. Their world had shrunk to the 5-foot radius around the pot-bellied stove. A few hundred yards away in the Lewandowski cabin, a different reality was unfolding. During the day, Tomasz kept a brisk, but not roaring fire going in his stove. The brick walls drank in the heat, feeling pleasantly warm to the touch. The air in the cabin was stable and still. By evening, he would let the fire die down to a bed of coals. And then, the wall would take over. The contrast was stark. Outside, the temperature plummeted to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The air so cold, it felt sharp in the lungs. Inside Tomasz's cabin, the temperature held steady at 65 degrees Fahrenheit all night long. There were no drafts because the 1-inch air gap between the brick and the logs acted as an additional layer of insulation, and the radiant heat from the wall neutralized any cold air that might have seeped in. The domestic warmth was proven in small, revolutionary ways. One evening, Elżbieta mixed a batch of bread dough. In any other cabin, it would have frozen solid within an hour. She placed the wooden bowl on a small bench near the brick wall. In the morning, it had risen beautifully, a perfect, pillowy dome, ready for baking. The constant, gentle warmth from the thermal mass had created a microclimate where life could flourish. Jan and Zofia played on the floor, not in heavy coats, but in simple wool sweaters. The floor itself, made of thick planks, laid over the earth, was drawing warmth from the base of the brick walls. It was no longer a source of cold, but a neutral, comfortable surface. They had defeated the winter. The crisis came for Ira Calkins on the 12th night of the freeze. The metal handle on his coal scuttle, weakened by the extreme cold, snapped. He was trying to bring in a load of precious coal to supplement his wood, and the bucket clattered to the frozen ground, spilling its contents. He had no spare. He needed to borrow one, or his fire would be dangerously low by morning. The closest neighbors were the Lewandowskis. Swallowing his pride, he bundled himself in his heaviest coat and walked the short distance, the snow squeaking like styrofoam under his boots. He knocked on the door, expecting to see a family huddled in misery, their foolish brick experiment having failed. Tomasz opened the door, and the first thing that hit Calkins was not a blast of frigid air, but a wave of calm, steady warmth. It was startling. He stepped inside, and the difference was so profound it made him dizzy. There was no roaring fire in the stove, only a low bed of glowing embers. Yet the air was warm, not hot and dry like by his own stove, but a deep, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My scuttle? It broke, Calkins stammered, feeling foolish. I wondered if I might borrow yours for the night. Of course, Tomasz said, gesturing for him to wait. While Tomasz went to fetch it, Calkins, out of sheer reflex, leaned his back against the wall to get out of the way. He braced for the familiar, shocking cold of an exterior wall in January. It never came. What he felt instead was impossible. A gentle, persistent heat radiated through his thick wool coat, warming his back, his kidneys, his very bones. He pressed his bare palm flat against the brick. It wasn't hot. It was just warm. A living warmth. He looked at the stove, then at the wall, and in that instant, his entire understanding of how a house worked was shattered. He saw a damp child's coat hanging on a peg near the wall. That'll be frozen stiff by morning, he said, making an observation based on a lifetime of experience. No, Elżbieta said softly, smiling. It will be dry. When Calkins returned to the scuttle the next morning, the first thing he did was walk over to the small coat. He touched it. It was perfectly, impossibly dry, and soft to the touch. The slow, radiant heat from the wall had gently evaporated all the moisture overnight. No fire had been needed. The proof was undeniable, tactile, and final. He looked at Tomasz, at the quiet brickmaker who had endured the community's doubt. He looked at the wall, this strange, massive thing that had seemed so foolish. He finally understood. You didn't build a wall, Tomasz, Ira Calkins said, his voice filled with a new kind of respect. You built a hearth the size of a room. Ira Calkins was a proud man, but he was not a fool. When presented with irrefutable proof, he did not double down on his pride. He embraced the new truth with the zeal of a convert. He became the Lewandowski method's most vocal advocate. He told everyone who would listen. He described the warmth, the dry coat, the feeling of the wall itself breathing heat into the room long after the fire was gone. His reputation as a builder gave his words weight. The mockery turned to curiosity, then to genuine interest. That spring, a change took place in the valley. Instead of each man for himself, a new cooperation emerged. Led by Calkins and advised by Tomasz, the settlers organized. They chose a large communal clay pit by the river. They built a massive, efficient kiln, far superior to Tomasz's first temporary clamp. Families worked together, molding and stacking thousands of bricks. They fired them in huge, shared batches, the glow visible for miles. By the fall of 1883, more than a dozen cabins in the valley had been retrofitted with Lewandowski's inner heat sink walls. The language of the valley changed. Men who had once spoken only of insulation and tight seams now talked of thermal mass and heat retention. They were learning a new way to think about shelter. The following winter was just as cold, but the suffering was gone. The demand for firewood across the settlement dropped by nearly 40%. The Polish wall had become the new standard of frontier construction. The simple, powerful idea pioneered by a quiet brickmaker had a reach far beyond the small Wisconsin valley. It was an early, intuitive application of principles that are now central to modern, sustainable building science. Tomasz Lewandowski's cabin was, in effect, a passive solar house, even without large windows. It stored energy from an intermittent source, the stove, and used it to maintain a stable temperature. Today, architects use the same principle. They design homes with high-mass materials like concrete floors, trombe walls, or brick features that are strategically placed to absorb heat from the sun during the day and release it slowly throughout the night. This reduces the reliance on active heating systems, saving energy and creating a more comfortable living environment. Tomasz, with his hands-on knowledge of how fired clay behaves, had stumbled upon a timeless architectural truth a century before it became fashionable. He wasn't following a blueprint. He was following the fundamental laws of physics. There is a simple, profound beauty in the theme that guided Tomasz Lewandowski's work, a theme born from his own life and trade. Clay that survives fire learns to hold it. The raw, wet clay from the riverbank was fragile. It could be washed away by rain or dissolved in water. But when subjected to the intense, transformative heat of the kiln, its very nature was altered. It became something permanent, something that could endure the elements, and most importantly, something that could absorb and hold the very energy that forged it. Tomasz himself was like that clay. Uprooted from his home, subjected to the brutal fire of that first Wisconsin winter, he did not break. He was transformed. The hardship burned away his reliance on old, inadequate methods and forged a new resolve. He used the memory of that terrible cold not as a source of fear, but as a catalyst for innovation. The knowledge he carried within him, the deep, old-world understanding of heat and mass, was the tool he used to build not just a warmer home, but a secure future for his family and his community. He learned to hold the warmth, both literally and figuratively, in a land that was determined to take it away. His legacy was not written in books, but in the warm, solid walls of the homes that stood against the winter for generations to come. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. The practical wisdom of the past often holds the keys to the challenges of the present. If you found this story as inspiring as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales of forgotten innovators. And we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other old-world skills do you think were invaluable for survival on the frontier? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. The building techniques and scientific principles discussed are based on real historical practices and physics. However, any modern application of these or similar techniques should be undertaken in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.